Your card has been declined, ma'am. The words were soft, almost apologetic, but they landed louder than anything else in that quiet pharmacy. For a moment, no one moved. Not the cashier, not the couple waiting behind me, and certainly not my son standing just a few feet away. I felt it before I even looked at him, the shift, the distance, the quiet decision to step back instead of step in. When I turned my head, Daniel was already looking somewhere else, pretending to be interested in a display of vitamins near the register. I remember thinking how strange it was that a person you once held as a baby could learn to look right through you like that. I smiled. Not because anything about that moment was pleasant, but because I had learned, over the years, that dignity is often the only thing people can't take from you unless you hand it over. That's all right, I said calmly to the cashier. Could you try it again? My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. The young woman nodded and ran the card once more. The machine beeped again. Declined. The sound seemed sharper the second time, as if it had gained confidence. Behind me, I could feel the weight of quiet attention. No one said anything, but I could sense the subtle shift, the kind that happens when strangers begin to form silent conclusions about you. Fixed income. Forgetful. Another older woman who couldn't keep track of her own finances. I reached into my purse slowly, giving myself just enough time to think. This didn't make sense. I knew exactly how much money was in my account. I had checked it just a few days ago, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the morning sunlight coming through the blinds. Everything had been in order. Everything had been exactly where it should be. Let me try another card, I said, even though I knew I didn't need to. I wasn't searching for a solution. I was buying myself a moment. A moment to understand what I was feeling, because it wasn't embarrassment. Not really. It was something colder. Something quieter. The kind of feeling that settles in your chest when a small detail doesn't fit, and you realize it might not be a mistake at all. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Ashley. She stood slightly behind Daniel, her phone in her hand, her expression carefully neutral. She didn't offer to help. She didn't ask if everything was okay. She simply scrolled, her thumb moving steadily across the screen as if nothing unusual was happening. It was such a small thing, that gesture. So easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But I had started paying attention a long time ago. I handed over a different card, one I rarely used, and waited. This time, the machine approved the transaction with a soft chime, and just like that, the moment dissolved. The cashier smiled, relieved. There we go, she said, handing me my receipt. I thanked her, gathered my things, and turned toward the exit. Daniel followed a step behind me, his hands in his pockets, his silence louder now than anything he could have said. Outside, the air was cool, carrying that faint medicinal scent that seemed to cling to everything near the pharmacy. I paused for just a second before walking to the car, not because I needed the rest, but because I needed the clarity. Something had already happened. I could feel it with a certainty that didn't need proof, not yet. It wasn't about a declined card. It wasn't about a moment of inconvenience or a technical error. It was about the way my son had chosen to look away. It was about the way my daughter-in-law had chosen not to look at all. And most of all, it was about the quiet understanding settling into place inside me, piece by piece, like something I had been assembling without realizing it. I opened the passenger door and sat down, placing my purse carefully on my lap. My hands were steady as I reached inside and pulled out my phone. For years, I had trusted that everything was being taken care of. For years, I had allowed small decisions to be made, for my convenience, passwords updated, statements redirected, accounts simplified. It had all seemed so reasonable at the time. So thoughtful. So efficient. I unlocked the screen and opened my banking app, my reflection faintly visible in the glass for just a moment before it disappeared. I entered my password slowly, deliberately, as if each digit mattered more than the last. The page loaded. And that was when I saw it. Not a mistake. Not a delay. Something else entirely. And in that quiet space, sitting in a parked car with the engine still off, I understood that whatever had been taken from me, it hadn't happened today. Today was simply the first time I had been meant to notice. I did not say anything to Daniel on the drive home. Neither did he speak to me. The silence between us felt different now, not awkward, not temporary, but settled, as if something had quietly shifted into place and neither of us was willing to disturb it. Ashley sat in the back seat, her phone still in her hand, the soft glow of the screen reflecting against the window as the city passed by in a blur of muted colors. At one point, Daniel cleared his throat, like he was about to say something, but whatever it was never made it into words. I kept my eyes forward, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my purse resting exactly where I had placed it. Inside that purse, my phone felt heavier than it had ever felt before, as if the truth sitting behind that banking screen had weight to it, something tangible, something real. When we pulled into my driveway, Daniel parked but did not turn off the engine right away. The low hum filled the car, steady and persistent. "Mom," he finally said, his voice careful, almost rehearsed, "about earlier, those machines mess up sometimes. You should probably call the bank. Just to be safe." I turned my head slowly and looked at him. Not long, not intensely, just enough to let the moment settle. "Yes," I said softly. "I think I will." He nodded quickly, relieved perhaps that I had not asked more, that I had not pressed him in that moment. Ashley did not look up. I stepped out of the car, thanked him for the ride, and walked to my front door with the same measured pace I had used for years. Nothing about my movements betrayed what I now knew. Inside, the house greeted me with its usual quiet. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the same rhythm it had kept through birthdays, holidays, and long afternoons spent alone. I set my purse down on the kitchen table and removed my coat, hanging it carefully on the hook by the door. Everything was exactly where it should be. Everything looked the same. And yet, nothing felt the same anymore. I sat down at the table and pulled out my phone again. This time, there was no hesitation. I opened the banking app and studied the numbers in front of me, not with shock, but with a kind of quiet focus I had not felt in a long time. The balance was lower than it should have been. Not by a small amount. Not by something easily explained away. It was precise, deliberate. I scrolled down through the transactions, my finger moving slowly, taking in each entry one by one. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Payments, transfers, small withdrawals. The kind of activity that would not raise suspicion if you were not looking closely. But I was looking closely now. Very closely. There were charges I did not recognize. Payments to places I had never been. Online orders that did not belong to me. And then there were the transfers. Larger amounts, spaced out just enough to avoid attention, moving from my account to another account I did not immediately recognize. I paused there, my finger resting lightly against the screen. It would have been easy, at that moment, to feel overwhelmed. To feel betrayed in a way that demanded immediate confrontation. But that was not what came over me. Instead, there was clarity. A steady, unshakable clarity that settled in like a quiet voice saying, "Pay attention." I leaned back slightly in my chair and let my eyes drift around the kitchen. The same kitchen where I had signed papers months ago, letting Ashley help me simplify things. The same kitchen where Daniel had smiled and told me it was just easier this way, that I did not need to worry about passwords or statements or remembering due dates. "We will take care of everything, Mom," he had said. And I had believed him. Not because I was careless, but because I was his mother. Because trust, when it comes from a lifetime of love, does not feel like a risk. It feels like the most natural thing in the world. I looked back at the screen and continued scrolling. The pattern became clearer the longer I watched. This had not started recently. This had been happening for months. Quietly. Consistently. Carefully. I noticed something else then. My email notifications from the bank were gone. The usual alerts I used to receive were no longer there. I opened my email app and searched for them, but the last notification was from weeks ago. That was not an accident. That was a change. A change I had not made. I set the phone down on the table for a moment and folded my hands together, resting them lightly against the wood. My breathing was steady. My thoughts were steady. There was no rush now, no urgency to react. Whatever had been done had already been done. What mattered now was understanding it completely. Outside, a car passed by slowly, its tires rolling over the pavement with a soft, distant sound. Life, as it always does, continued without interruption. I picked up my phone again and took one more look at the account, at the numbers that no longer belonged to me in the way they once had. And in that quiet kitchen, with the afternoon light stretching across the table, I made a decision. I would not ask questions. Not yet. I would not confront, not accuse, not reveal what I had seen. Because whatever they thought I knew, it was not enough. Not nearly enough. And for the first time in a very long time, I understood that silence was not weakness. It was strategy. The next morning, I woke up at exactly 6:30, the same time I had woken up for years, even after retirement made it unnecessary. Habit, I had learned, does not disappear just because life changes. It lingers, quietly anchoring you when everything else begins to shift. I moved through my routine without interruption, making coffee, opening the blinds, letting the soft morning light settle across the kitchen floor. From the outside, nothing about my life had changed. But inside, something had sharpened. I sat at the table with my coffee and my phone, not rushing, not hesitating, simply continuing what I had started the day before. I opened my bank account again, not because I needed to confirm what I had already seen, but because I wanted to understand it fully. There is a difference between knowing something is wrong and knowing exactly how it went wrong. I scrolled through the transactions again, slower this time, paying attention to dates, patterns, timing. The transfers were not random. They were spaced out, consistent in their inconsistency, if that made any sense at all. Always just small enough to avoid immediate attention, always just far enough apart to seem ordinary. Whoever had done this had not been careless. That realization did not upset me. It clarified things. I reached for a notepad I kept in the drawer beside the table and began writing down the transactions one by one. Dates. Amounts. Destinations. I did not rush. Each number went down neatly, deliberately, as if I were copying something important, because I was. Halfway through, I noticed something else. The receiving account number appeared more than once. Not identical every time, but close enough to suggest a pattern. That was when I paused, tapping the pen lightly against the paper. I had seen that sequence before. Not in the bank app. Somewhere else. Somewhere familiar. I leaned back slightly, closing my eyes for just a moment, letting memory do what it does best when you give it space. And then it came to me. A check. Months ago. Ashley had written a check at my kitchen table, explaining something about a temporary transfer, something about organizing accounts to make things easier. I had not thought twice about it at the time. Why would I have? She had smiled. Daniel had been sitting right there, nodding along, telling me it was all perfectly normal. I opened my eyes and looked back down at the numbers I had written. The pattern was no longer abstract. It was familiar. And familiarity, I realized, is often where the truth hides best. I set the pen down carefully and picked up my phone again, navigating to the section that showed account details. I compared what I saw on the screen with what I had written on paper, line by line, number by number. The connection was not complete, not yet, but it was close enough to remove any remaining doubt. This had not been an error. This had not been the bank. This had been done by someone who had access. Someone who had been trusted. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, looking out. At the quiet street. A neighbor was walking his dog, the leash held loosely in his hand as the dog moved from one patch of grass to another, completely unaware of anything beyond its immediate world. For a moment, I envied that simplicity. Then I let the thought pass. Simplicity is comforting, but it is also blinding. And I was no longer blind. Behind me, my phone buzzed softly against the table. A message. I turned back and picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was from Ashley. "Hey, just checking in. Everything okay after yesterday?" The words were casual, light, perfectly reasonable. I read them once, then again, noting the timing. Not too soon. Not too late. Just enough to seem thoughtful without drawing attention. I did not respond right away. Instead, I set the phone back down and returned to my seat, folding my hands again, just as I had done the day before. The question was not whether everything was okay. The question was what she believed I knew. And more importantly, what she believed I would do about it. I picked up the phone again and typed a reply, keeping it simple, keeping it consistent with the version of me they were used to seeing. "Everything is fine, dear. Just a small issue with the card. I will call the bank today." I read the message once before sending it, making sure there was nothing in it that suggested anything beyond mild inconvenience. Then I pressed send. The response came quickly. "Good, let me know if you need help with anything." I smiled at that. Not because it was kind, but because it was predictable. I set the phone down and looked again at the list of transactions in front of me. Dates. Numbers. Patterns. Pieces of something larger that was slowly, steadily revealing itself. And as I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, I understood something with absolute clarity. They believed I was still the same woman who handed over control without question. They believed I was still someone who would accept explanations without looking too closely. They believed I would remain exactly where they had placed me. And that belief, I realized, was going to be their mistake. By the afternoon, I had already finished writing down every transaction I could find, each one lined up neatly on the page in front of me like a quiet confession that no one had intended for me to read. I did not rush to call the bank, even though that would have been the most obvious next step. Instead, I did something else. I made lunch, the same simple meal I had made countless times before, a sandwich, a small bowl of soup, a glass of water. I sat at the table and ate slowly, not because I was hungry, but because I understood that maintaining normalcy was part of what I needed to do now. If anyone had walked into my kitchen at that moment, they would have seen nothing unusual. Just a woman going about her day. Just a routine. That was important. After I finished, I washed my dishes, dried them, and placed them back exactly where they belonged. Then I returned to the table, sat down, and picked up my phone again. This time, I did not open my banking app. Instead, I opened my email settings. I moved through each section carefully, not skipping anything, not assuming anything. It did not take long to find what I was looking for. The notification email address linked to my bank account had been changed. It was no longer mine. The new address was one I did not recognize, but I did not need to. I already knew who it belonged to. I did not react. I simply noted it, the same way I had noted everything else. Piece by piece, the picture was becoming complete. I set the phone down and allowed myself a single, slow breath. This was not something that had been done in a moment of desperation. This was planned. Organized. Maintained over time. That realization did not bring anger. It brought something far more useful. Precision. I stood up and walked to the small desk in the corner of my living room, the one I had not used much in recent months. Inside the top drawer, I kept a folder with old documents, things I had not felt the need to review in a long time. I opened it and began sorting through the papers, one by one, until I found what I was looking for. Bank statements from before everything had changed. Before passwords had been updated. Before access had been shared. I compared them to what I had seen on my phone earlier. The difference was not just in the numbers. It was in the control. There had been a time when everything came directly to me. When every detail passed through my hands first. That had changed, slowly, quietly, in ways that had seemed reasonable at the time. I remembered the conversations clearly now. Ashley sitting across from me at this very table, her voice calm, reassuring, explaining how online banking could be confusing, how scams were becoming more common, how it would be safer if she helped manage things. Daniel had agreed, of course. He always agreed with her in those moments. "It is just easier this way, Mom," he had said. "You should not have to worry about all of this." And I had nodded. I had signed what needed to be signed. I had handed over what needed to be handed over. Not because I was incapable, but because I trusted them. I closed the folder slowly and placed it back in the drawer, not hiding it, not discarding it, simply returning it to where it belonged. Then I sat down at the desk and turned on my laptop. The screen flickered to life, casting a soft glow across the room. I navigated to the bank's website and paused for just a moment before logging in. This was different from the app. This required more information, more verification. I entered my credentials carefully, the same ones I had always used before anything had been changed. For a brief second, I wondered if they would still work. They did. The account opened, and with it came a deeper level of detail. I moved through the sections slowly, reviewing settings, permissions, linked accounts. There it was again. The unfamiliar email address. The additional authorized access. Changes that had been made without my direct involvement, but not without my consent. That was the part that mattered. I had not been locked out. I had been guided away. I leaned back in my chair and let my hands rest lightly on the keyboard. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to shift, stretching longer shadows across the floor. Time was moving forward, as it always does, but I was no longer moving with it in the same way. I was watching now. Understanding. And as I sat there, looking at the account that no longer fully belonged to me, I realized something that settled into place with absolute certainty. This was not about taking everything at once. It was about taking just enough, slowly enough, that I would never notice. That I would never question. That I would remain exactly where they needed me to be. I closed the laptop gently and folded my hands together once more. They had been careful. Thoughtful, even. But they had made one assumption that changed everything. They had assumed I would never look closely. And now that I had, there was no going back. That evening, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I sat in my living room without turning on the television, without reaching for a book, without filling the silence with anything unnecessary. I simply sat there, letting the quiet settle around me, letting my thoughts move at their own pace instead of rushing to catch them. It was in that stillness that the past began to rearrange itself. Not as isolated memories, but as a pattern. A sequence. Something that had always been there, waiting to be seen clearly. I thought about the first time Ashley offered to help with my finances. It had been subtle, almost thoughtful in its presentation. She had not taken control all at once. She had suggested small things. Organizing bills. Setting up automatic payments. Making sure everything was efficient. Daniel had supported her, of course. He always did. At the time, it had felt like care. Like support. Like family working together. Now, sitting alone in that quiet room, I could see it differently. Not as a single decision, but as a series of small steps that led to the same place. Each one reasonable. Each one easy to accept. Each one moving me just slightly further away from control. I stood up slowly and walked to the hallway, stopping in front of the mirror. For a moment, I just looked at myself. Not with judgment, not with regret, but with clarity. The woman looking back at me was not confused. She was not fragile. She was not unaware. She was someone who had trusted deeply, and in doing so, had been guided into a position she had not fully understood. That did not make her weak. It made her human. I returned to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, taking a slow sip as I considered what needed to happen next. Not emotionally. Not impulsively. Strategically. There is a difference between reacting and responding, and I had no intention of doing the former. I picked up my phone and opened the contacts list, scrolling down until I found a name I had not needed to call in years. Mr. Harris. My late husband's attorney. He had handled our estate planning long before everything had changed, long before Ashley had entered the picture. I did not press the call button right away. Instead, I looked at the name for a moment, letting the weight of that decision settle in. This was not about confrontation. Not yet. This was about information. About understanding exactly what had been signed, what had been authorized, what could be changed. I set the phone down and walked to the cabinet where I kept my important documents. Not the ones Ashley had helped organize, but the older ones. The ones that had not been touched in years. I opened the drawer and began sorting through them, my movements steady, deliberate. Deeds. Insurance policies. Old account agreements. Pieces of a life that had once been entirely within my control. As I flipped through the papers, I noticed something that made me pause. A power of attorney document. Signed. Dated. My signature at the bottom, clear and unmistakable. I remembered signing it. I remembered the conversation. It had been presented as a precaution, something to make things easier in case of emergencies. Something responsible. Something necessary. I had not questioned it. Why would I have? I trusted them. I trusted my son. I trusted the woman he had chosen to build his life with. I closed the folder slowly and placed it on the table, my fingers resting lightly on top of it. That was it. That was how it had been done. Not by force. Not by deception in the way people usually imagine. But by trust. By timing. By presenting something ordinary in a moment when I had no reason to see it as anything else. I sat down again and looked at the document in front of me, not with anger, but with understanding. This had not been a sudden act. It had been built, step by step, decision by decision, until it became something I no longer recognized as my own doing. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, the last light of the day fading into evening. I picked up my phone once more and this time, I pressed the call button. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Calm. Professional. Unchanged. Mr. Harris, I said, my voice steady, my tone even. This is Margaret Collins. I believe it is time we reviewed some documents. There was a brief pause on the other end, not of confusion, but of recognition. Of course, Mrs. Collins, he replied. When would you like to come in? I glanced down at the folder in front of me, at the signature that had once meant trust and now meant something entirely different. As soon as possible, I said quietly. And for the first time since the moment in the pharmacy, I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. Not because anything about this situation was pleasant, but because I finally understood something they did not. I was not behind. I was not lost. I was simply at the beginning of seeing everything clearly. The next morning, I dressed more carefully than usual, not in anything extravagant, but in something deliberate. A navy blazer, pressed slacks, low heels that made a quiet, confident sound against the floor as I walked. There is a certain kind of preparation that has nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with intention, and that was what guided me that day. I arrived at Mr. Harris's office 10 minutes early, just as I always had in the past. The building had not changed. The same glass doors, the same polished floors, the same quiet professionalism that had once made me feel secure. I checked in at the front desk and took a seat in the waiting area, my folder resting neatly on my lap. Around me, people came and went, their conversations low, their movements purposeful. It was a place where decisions were made carefully, where words carried weight. That was exactly why I had come. When Mr. Harris greeted me, his expression softened slightly in recognition, but there was also something else there. Respect. Not the kind given automatically, but the kind that comes from understanding that the person sitting across from you is not here by accident. We sat down in his office, and I placed the folder on his desk, opening it slowly, revealing the documents inside without dramatics, without explanation. He adjusted his glasses and began to review them, his eyes moving steadily across the pages. I did not interrupt. I did not fill the silence. I let him see what he needed to see. After a few minutes, he leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Collins," he said carefully, "these documents grant a significant level of control to your son and daughter-in-law." I nodded once. "I understand that now," I replied. My voice was calm, even, carrying none of the emotion that might have been expected in a situation like this. He studied me for a moment, as if measuring whether I fully grasped the implications. "They have the authority to manage accounts, transfer funds, and make financial decisions on your behalf," he continued. "Provided it is within the scope outlined here." I folded my hands neatly on the desk. "And if those decisions are not in my best interest?" I asked. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Then there are options," he said. "But we would need to establish a clear pattern of misuse or overreach." A pattern. I almost smiled at that. Because that was exactly what I had. "I have documentation," I said simply, sliding the notepad toward him. He looked down at it, reading through the dates, the amounts, the repetition. His expression changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to confirm that what I had seen was not something easily dismissed. "Have you confronted them about this?" he asked. "No," I replied. "And I will not. Not yet." He nodded slowly, understanding more than I needed to explain. "That may be wise," he said. "In situations like this, it is often best to gather as much information as possible before taking any action." I sat back in my chair, letting his words settle into place. This was no longer a question of suspicion. It was a matter of process. Of steps. Of timing. "What do I need to do?" I asked. He outlined it clearly, methodically. We would begin by securing my accounts. Establishing new access points. Restricting the authority that had been granted under the existing documents. Not abruptly. Not in a way that would immediately alert them. But gradually. Strategically. At the same time, we would document everything. Every transaction. Every change. Every detail that demonstrated a pattern. As he spoke, I listened without interruption, absorbing each step, each requirement. This was not overwhelming. It was structured. Controlled. Exactly what I needed. When he finished, he looked at me again, his gaze steady. "This will take time," he said. "And discretion." I inclined my head slightly. "I have both," I replied. When I left his office, the air outside felt different. Not lighter, not easier, but clearer. I walked to my car, unlocked the door, and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked the same as it always had. But I knew better now. I was no longer reacting to something that had happened to me. I was preparing for what would happen next. I started the car and pulled out onto the street, my hands steady on the wheel, my movements precise. There was no urgency in what I was doing. No rush to resolve everything in a single moment. Because this was not a moment. It was a process. And for the first time since everything began to unfold, I understood that I was not trying to catch up. I was setting the pace. When I returned home, I did not go straight inside. I sat in my car for a moment longer than necessary, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, feeling the quiet hum of the engine beneath my palms. There was something steady about that sound, something grounding. It reminded me that control, once understood, could be reclaimed in small, deliberate ways. I turned off the engine, gathered my things, and stepped out into the afternoon light with the same measured pace I had carried all morning. Inside, the house welcomed me with its familiar stillness, but now that stillness felt different. It no longer felt empty. It felt like space. Space to think. Space to act. I set my purse down on the kitchen table and took out my phone, not to check anything, but to continue what had already begun. Mr. Harris had been clear. This would not be a single action. It would be a sequence. And sequences require patience. I opened my laptop again and navigated to a different bank this time, one I had not used in years but had once trusted. The process of opening a new account was straightforward, almost routine, but I moved through it with a heightened awareness, paying attention to every detail, every setting, every option. This time, nothing would be shared. Nothing would be delegated. When I entered my contact information, I paused briefly, making sure every piece of it belonged only to me. My email. My phone number. My address. No forwarding. No secondary access. When I finished, I sat back and reviewed everything once more before confirming. It was a small step, but it was mine. After that, I returned to my existing account, not to make changes yet, but to observe. To understand how and when the transfers were happening. Patterns reveal timing, and timing reveals opportunity. I scrolled through the most recent activity and noted the dates again, aligning them in my mind with something else. Visits. Conversations. Moments when Ashley had been particularly attentive, particularly helpful. It was subtle, but it was there. A correlation that might have been invisible before now stood out clearly. I closed the laptop and reached for the folder I had brought back from Mr. Harris's office. Inside, I placed the notepad with the transactions, organizing everything neatly, not for anyone else, but for myself. Clarity requires structure. Without it, even the truth can feel scattered. My phone buzzed again, breaking the quiet. This time, it was Daniel. I looked at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hi, Mom," he said, his tone light, almost casual. "Just wanted to check if you got everything sorted with the bank." I smiled slightly, though he could not see it. "I am looking into it," I replied. "It seems like a small issue." There was a brief pause on the line, just long enough to notice. "Good," he said quickly. "Let me know if you need anything." "Ashley said she can help if you want." Of course she did. "That is kind of her," I said evenly. "But I think I will handle it myself." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Okay," he said. "Just wanted to make sure you are not dealing with it alone." I let that sit for a moment before responding. "I am not alone," I said softly. "I am simply taking care of things." The distinction mattered, even if he did not fully understand it yet. We ended the call shortly after, the conversation polite, uneventful, exactly what it needed to be. I set the phone down and folded my hands on the table, considering the next step. Mr. Harris had mentioned discretion, and that meant more than just silence. It meant consistency. No sudden changes. No unusual behavior. I would continue as I always had, answering messages, accepting help when it was offered, allowing them to believe that nothing had shifted. Because from their perspective, nothing had. That was the advantage. Later that evening, I received another message from Ashley. A simple one. "We are stopping by tomorrow. Just to check on you." I read it once, then set the phone aside without responding immediately. Instead, I stood up and walked through the house, room by room, noticing the small details I had overlooked before. The placement of documents. The organization of drawers. The way certain things had been rearranged under the guise of helping. It was all there, if you knew how to look. When I returned to the kitchen, I picked up my phone and typed a reply. "That would be lovely. I will make tea." I sent it and placed the phone back on the table, my movements calm, unhurried. Tomorrow would not be about confrontation. It would be about observation. About seeing what they did when they believed everything was still exactly as they had left it. I sat down once more, the quiet of the house settling around me, but this time it carried something new. Not uncertainty. Not confusion. Something far more steady. Control, I realized, does not return all at once. It returns in moments. In decisions. In the quiet understanding that you no longer need to react, because you are already moving ahead. The next afternoon, I prepared the House the same way I always did when Daniel and Ashley came over, not because it was necessary, but because consistency matters more than people realize. The tea set was placed neatly on the table, the same one I had used for years, the same one Ashley had once admired when she first started visiting. I arranged everything carefully, each cup aligned, each spoon placed just so. Not out of habit alone, but because details have a way of grounding a moment, of making everything feel exactly as expected. And today, that was important. When the doorbell rang, I did not rush. I walked to the door at a steady pace and opened it with a small, welcoming smile. Ashley stepped in first, her expression warm, practiced, the kind of smile that had once made me feel reassured. Daniel followed behind her, his posture relaxed, his presence familiar. Nothing about them suggested urgency. Nothing about them suggested concern. That told me everything I needed to know. "Mom," Daniel said, leaning in for a brief hug. "How are you feeling today?" I returned the gesture lightly. "I am just fine," I replied. It was a small issue, nothing more. Ashley's eyes flickered briefly at that, not enough for someone who was not paying attention, but enough for me. "We just wanted to make sure," she said, her tone gentle, almost careful. Sometimes those things can be confusing. I nodded once, leading them into the kitchen. "I appreciate that," I said. "But I have been going through everything, and it seems manageable." I watched her reaction closely as I poured the tea, my movements slow and precise. She did not interrupt. She did not offer assistance. She simply observed, her expression composed, but there was a slight tension in the way she held her cup when I handed it to her. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed more at ease, as if the situation had already been resolved in his mind. "That is good," he said, taking a sip. "We just did not want you stressing over something like that." Something like that. I let the phrase settle in the air for a moment before responding. "No," I said softly. "There is no need for stress when things are clear." Ashley glanced at him then, quickly, a small look. That might have been missed if I had not been expecting it. It was not fear. Not yet. But it was awareness. A quiet recognition that something was not unfolding the way she had anticipated. We sat together for a while, the conversation moving through ordinary topics, the weather, a neighbor's new car, a small story Daniel shared about work. I listened, I responded, I maintained the rhythm of familiarity that they were used to. But underneath it all, I was watching. Not just what they said, but how they said it. The pauses. The glances. The subtle shifts in tone when certain subjects came close to the edge of something more. At one point, Ashley set her cup down and looked at me directly. "Did you talk to the bank yet?" she asked, her voice light, almost casual. I met her gaze evenly. "I have started looking into it," I replied. "There are a few things I want to review before I make any calls." Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table, a small movement, almost imperceptible. "Well," she said, "if you need help understanding anything, I can always take a look. Sometimes it is easier when someone else handles it." There it was. Offered again. Not forcefully. Not urgently. But consistently. I smiled, just enough to be polite. "That is very kind of you," I said. "But I think I should stay involved this time. It is important for me to understand everything." Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his expression unreadable for a brief moment before it settled back into something neutral. "Of course," he said. "Whatever makes you comfortable." Comfortable. I repeated the word silently, considering how easily it had been used before, how often it had been the reason for decisions I no longer fully recognized as my own. The visit did not last long after that. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic moment. Just a quiet, polite conclusion, the kind that leaves everything exactly where it appears to be. When they stood to leave, Ashley hugged me lightly, her movements controlled, her expression carefully composed. "Call me if you need anything," she said. I nodded. "I will," I replied. Daniel gave me a brief smile before following her out. The door, and just like that, they were gone. I closed the door gently and stood there for a moment, listening to the fading sound of their car pulling away. The house returned to silence, but this time, it was not empty. It was full of information. Full of confirmation. I walked back to the kitchen and looked at the 2 cups they had used, still sitting on the table. Nothing had been said directly. Nothing had been admitted. And yet, everything had been revealed. I gathered the cups slowly and carried them to the sink, rinsing them one by one, my movements steady, unhurried. They believed the situation was contained. They believed I was still uncertain, still dependent, still within the boundaries they had quietly built around me. I placed the last cup on the drying rack and turned off the faucet, the sound of running water fading into silence. And in that silence, one thing became absolutely clear. They were still playing the same game. The only difference now was that I understood the rules. That night, I did not turn on any lights in the living room. I sat in the dim glow coming from the kitchen, letting the house remain quiet, almost as if I were preserving something delicate. There are moments when silence is not emptiness, but preparation. And this was one of them. I brought the folder from earlier back to the table and opened it again, not because I needed to confirm what I already knew, but because I wanted to refine it. Details matter more the second time you look at them. I reviewed the transactions once more, this time adding small notes beside certain entries, marking patterns, grouping similar amounts, identifying the rhythm behind the transfers. It was no longer just a list. It was a timeline. A story written in numbers. And every story, when read carefully enough, reveals its author. I noticed something new this time, not in the transactions themselves, but in the spacing between them. There were gaps. Predictable ones. Periods where nothing was touched, followed by small clusters of activity. It was not random. It aligned with something else. Visits. Conversations. Moments when Ashley had access, when she was present, when she had reason to be involved. I sat back slightly, letting that realization settle into place. This was not just about control. It was about timing. About choosing moments when everything appeared normal. When nothing would raise suspicion. That level of care required confidence. And confidence comes from believing you will not be questioned. I closed the folder gently and reached for my phone, opening the new account I had created earlier that day. It was empty, of course, but that was not the point. The point was ownership. Control that existed entirely within my reach. I navigated through the settings again, ensuring everything was secured, every notification directed only to me, every access point closed to anyone else. This time, there would be no shared responsibility. No helpful oversight. Just clarity. After that, I returned to my original account, not to change anything yet, but to observe once more. There was a new transaction pending. Small. Unremarkable. Exactly the kind that would go unnoticed under normal circumstances. I studied it for a moment, noting the amount, the timing, the destination. Then I did something different. I did not react. I did not attempt to stop it. I let it remain exactly where it was. Because understanding requires observation, and observation requires patience. If I moved too quickly, I would disrupt the pattern before I fully understood it. And I was not finished understanding. My phone buzzed again, a soft interruption in the quiet. Another message from Ashley. Just wanted to say it was nice seeing you today. I read it once, then set the phone down without responding. Not immediately. Timing, I had learned, mattered in more ways than one. Instead, I stood up and walked through the house again, this time with a different awareness. I opened drawers, not searching, but noticing. I checked the small cabinet where I kept spare documents, the one Ashley had reorganized months ago. Everything was neat. Too neat. Categories that made sense on the surface, but also made certain things easier to access, easier to move without drawing attention. I closed the cabinet slowly and returned to the table, picking up my phone once more. I typed a simple reply. It was nice seeing you too. Nothing more. Nothing that suggested anything beyond normalcy. When I sent it, I felt the same quiet certainty settle in again. They believed the situation was stable. They believed nothing had changed. And that belief was still working in my favor. I sat down and folded my hands, looking at the folder in front of me, at the phone beside it, at the quiet space around me that now felt entirely my own. There was no urgency in what I was doing. No need to rush toward confrontation or resolution. Because this was not about catching them in a single moment. It was about allowing them to continue, to reveal more, to confirm what I already suspected in ways that could not be dismissed. Outside, the night had fully settled, the streetlights casting long, steady shadows across the pavement. I watched them for a moment through the window, their stillness mirroring my own. And as I sat there, in the quiet of my home, I understood something with complete clarity. They believed they were in control because nothing had stopped. Because nothing had changed. Because I had not reacted. But control, I realized, is not about what is visible. It is about what is understood. And now, I understood everything I needed to begin moving forward. The following morning, I woke up before my alarm, not because I was restless, but because something inside me had already moved ahead of the day. There is a difference between waiting for something to happen and knowing that it already has. I made my coffee the same way I always did, measured, deliberate, the quiet routine grounding me in a way that no amount of thought could replace. When I sat down at the table, I did not reach for my phone immediately. Instead, I looked around the kitchen, at the familiar details that had once defined my sense of stability. The cabinets Ashley had reorganized. The drawer where she had neatly labeled everything for convenience. The small changes that had seemed helpful, thoughtful, even generous at the time. Now, they looked different. Not wrong. Just intentional in a way I had not fully understood before. After a few minutes, I picked up my phone and opened my account. Again. The pending transaction from the night before had gone through. Another small amount, another quiet movement, another piece of the pattern confirmed. I noted it carefully, adding it to the list in my folder, not with frustration, but with precision. Every entry mattered now. Every detail added weight. When I finished, I closed the folder and placed it neatly back on the table, my hands resting lightly on top of it. This was no longer about discovery. It was about preparation. I stood up and walked to the desk, opening my laptop once more, this time logging into the new account I had created. It was still untouched, still clean, still entirely under my control. That was about to change. I initiated a small transfer, not from the account they had access to, but from a separate source, something independent, something they would not notice. It was not about the amount. It was about establishing movement. Creating a new pattern that belonged only to me. When it was done, I sat back and watched the confirmation screen for a moment, letting the simplicity of it settle in. No shared access. No secondary approval. No quiet interference. Just control. My phone buzzed shortly after, another message from Daniel. "Hey Mom, just checking in again. Everything still okay?" I read it carefully, not for what it said, but for what it suggested. Frequency. Awareness. A need to confirm stability. I typed a response slowly. "Everything is fine. I spoke with someone and I am reviewing a few things." I paused before sending it, then pressed the button and set the phone down. The reply came faster this time. "Okay, good. Let us know if you need help. Let us know." The words lingered for a moment before I let them go. They still believed they were part of the solution. That belief was still useful. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where nothing appeared to have changed. Cars passed by. A neighbor waved as he walked his dog. Life continued in its steady, predictable rhythm. But inside, everything had shifted. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But completely. I returned to the table and opened the folder one last time, reviewing everything I had gathered. So far. The transactions. The patterns. The documents. It was all there, clear, structured, undeniable. And yet, I felt no urgency to act on it immediately. Because this was not the moment for confrontation. This was the moment before it. The moment where everything aligns, where every piece is exactly where it needs to be before anything is said. I closed the folder and placed it back in its spot, my movements calm, controlled. Then I picked up my phone and scrolled to Daniel's name, my thumb hovering over it for just a second before I pressed call. He answered on the second ring, his voice familiar, unaware. "Hey Mom," he said. "Everything okay?" I smiled slightly, though he could not see it. "Yes," I said softly. "Everything is very clear now." There was a pause on the line, just long enough to notice. "Clear," he repeated. I leaned back in my chair, my gaze steady, my voice even. "Yes," I said. "Clear enough that I think it is time we sit down and talk. You and Ashley. Together." The silence that followed was different this time. Not casual. Not comfortable. It carried weight. "About what?" he asked, his tone shifting just slightly. I let the question hang for a moment before answering. Not because I needed time, but because I wanted him to feel it. "About the account," I said quietly. "And everything connected to it." Another pause. Longer now. I could almost hear the realization beginning to form on the other end of the line. I did not fill the silence. I did not soften it. I simply held it there. Finally, he spoke again. "Okay," he said. "We can do that." I nodded, even though he could not see it. "Good," I replied. "Come by tomorrow evening." We ended the call shortly after, the conversation brief, controlled, exactly as it needed to be. I set the phone down and folded my hands on the table, the quiet of the house settling around me once more. But this time, it felt different. Not like preparation. Not like observation. Like something else entirely. Like the moment before a truth is no longer hidden. And as I sat there, in the same chair where I had once signed everything over without question, I allowed myself one final thought. They believed they understood the situation. They believed they knew what I would do. But tomorrow, they would learn something they had not accounted for. I was no longer the woman who needed to ask what was happening. I was the one who already knew.